When it comes to making a video game, the primary goal is to ensure that the gameplay is playable, long-lasting, and, most importantly, fun. It's often the very first thing that defines what type of video game you're playing, and it can be the determinant factor to liking the game. However, it didn't take long for storytelling to become a second, crucial aspect to video games, and while many would argue that it isn't necessary to make a good video game, it serves as proper justification for being able to accomplish what other forms of media could not. Sometimes regarded as being one of the only forms of non-linear entertainment. It also serves to connect the player to previous experiences, especially if the games were designed specifically to be a direct follow-up to its predecessor. Unfortunately, not every game manages to do this well, even those that were highly anticipated and had long development schedules. One of the primary criticisms to modern-day PlayStation Studios games is often that a lot of them focus too much on the story and less on gameplay, often resulting in being more like interactive movies. Actually, Nintendo was guilty of this issue when they created Skyward Sword, and combined with the motion controls of the game, the reception turned out to be one of the most split reactions in the community. On the other hand of the spectrum, some games simply focus too far into the innovation of gameplay, that the story being written for this new experience ends up being thrown out of the bus. A lot of these criticisms typically gravitate towards modern Nintendo games, like Paper Mario and even Fire Emblem, though Fire Emblem would be something that would leave up to Kaiser and Dakota to debate. My prime example of a Nintendo game that falls under this category is none other than The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom serves as a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, taking place a few years after those events and retaining the same world, the same characters, and the same history. This wasn't the first instance of the Zelda franchise having direct sequels, but this would be the first instance where the game is set in a near identical world as its predecessor, whereas previous direct sequels were set in a completely different location. Naturally, the expectations in writing and potential story progression would be very high. Additionally, Nintendo released a spin-off in 2020 titled Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, which was their second collaboration with Koei Tecmo on the Zelda franchise. This game was designed to hold players over while Tears of the Kingdom was still under development, and it was marketed as a prequel, though we know now that this was designed to subvert expectations for a story that turned out to be a sequel? Basically, it falls under the same category as Borderlands, the pre-sequel. One of the most noticeable aspects of Tears of the Kingdom's story is that it's structured almost identically to Breath of the Wild. Progression of the story is largely dictated by the order that the player chooses to go to, though elements of the game do provide a chronological sequence. However, the prologue will always remain the same, and the climax is altered based on the player's level of story progression, but it ultimately follows the same route. One key characteristic to these two games is that a large portion of the story is told retroactively through the form of memories, and while the game does feature cutscenes throughout much of its course, the majority of the cinematic storytelling is featured through these memories. The player can collect these memories in any order they please, leading most to gravitate towards the nearest locations. This is where the differences between the games are most noticeable. An important thing to remember is that the game does not outright recommend the player to collect these memories in chronological order. It only goes as far as displaying what would be sequential, but not everyone is going to understand that on their first playthrough of the game. This isn't really consequential in Breath of the Wild, as every memory has been written somewhat independently from one another, but leaves enough room for the player to connect the dots. It's pretty much like adding pieces to a jigsaw puzzle, but you don't strictly have to connect the border pieces first. You still see the bigger picture by forming and connecting smaller pieces here and there. Just as with the whole game itself, the beginning and end of this fetch quest remains to be linear. There are some prerequisites that you have to go through to find these memories, and one of the final memories to be unlocked does require the player to find the rest of the memories, so the culminating point of this quest remains the same. You're still trying to find out how Link was left in a dire state that left him in cryosleep for 100 years. Nowhere does this game really hint towards what it looks like, besides various mentions in character dialogue. This whole event ultimately remains a mystery up until that specific point. Everything I just talked about now is exactly what Tears of the Kingdom did not do. And effectively, it did quite the opposite. Tears of the Kingdom has its own memory structure, allowing players to find each one in any order they choose. But once again, the game doesn't outright tell you that there's a chronological order. The location that displays all the locations of the memories don't tell you to go clockwise in that one room, and as a result you may accidentally skip this if you're not paying attention. The beginning point to this fetch quest can actually be skipped as well. so you might accidentally watch these in a botched sequence. Stacking on the already rocky start of the memories themselves. The memories still have time skips in between each to maintain a level of independence, but unfortunately the content of the memories aren't actually designed to be following that discovery format. There are too many instances where the memories are referring back to previous memories. I think the most incriminating aspect is that you really only need to watch like 3 memories to actually get the full grasp of the game's backstory. One real consequence to not acquiring these memories in sequential order is that you may very well be spoiling one of the most important cutscenes that precede it. At that point, the dramatic effect is basically thrown out, ultimately due to a few seconds of exposition that didn't need to be written at all. To be more specific, the whole plot twist loses much of its effect when the player decides to play the game out of order and go for the Master Sword first. The Master Sword in both games end up providing the player with the last chronological memory in the game, but Breath of the Wild manages to play things safe by not showing explicitly what happens to Link, whereas Tears of the Kingdom really makes it obvious that Zelda is the Light Dragon, accompanied by the fact that the Light Dragon's music and appearance is very similar to Zelda. A secondary consequence to this is actually in the present day portion of the story. The first 4 dungeons in the game all relate to the numerous rumors and strange sightings of Zelda, and completing all 4 of them will lead the story to culminate in an event where the aforementioned plot twist would take place. As it turns out, all of these sightings of Zelda were revealed to be fake, and it was actually Phantom Ganon behind this. You see, this would have been the perfect setup. The whole game was deliberately designed for the player and Link himself to initially believe that this was the real Zelda, who had seemingly led every character into danger and prevented certain areas from being accessed. However, if you've gotten the Master Sword at this point, or all of the memories, this plot twist becomes the most painful bit of dramatic irony that anyone would be facing in the Zelda franchise. Much of this irony stems from the fact that Link is barely ever communicating any of this to people. It's entirely understandable that in Breath of the Wild, he's far too concerned with recovering his memories, and he couldn't jump to making judgments and speculation. But in the case of Tears of the Kingdom, he should have easily figured it out by now, because his only focus was to find Zelda. Come on man, speak up. All of that was just the problems associated with the memories of the game. What about the characters themselves? The characters who make major appearances throughout the game, and those who are integral to telling the story. This is where things go from mediocre to arguably bad. One of the key defining factors to Breath of the Wild was that despite the brief screen time of many of its major characters, we were introduced to quite a memorable cast. Known collectively as the Champions, these 4 characters served alongside Link and Zelda with the purpose of combating the impending threat of Calamity Ganon. These 4 characters each had unique interactions with Link and Zelda, some with connections rooted since childhood. If there's one thing for certain, it's that each of these characters aren't short of any personality, and they are easily identifiable by their traits and their music. Alongside these 4 champions were 4 more characters in Breath of the Wild who essentially patronize their respective now-dead champions. We'll call them champion descendants, even though only one of them is actually a real descendant. Yeah, there's a sibling in there too. Much like said champions, they don't actually get that much screen time, only appearing to assist Link in saving the champions, but not really involved in the actual game's finale. Nonetheless, they still remain quite memorable and could have easily been identified by their personalities, and especially appearance. The equivalent groups in Tears of the Kingdom are the Sages. Well, 2 groups of Sages. We have the Sages of the past, and the Sages of the present. The Sages of the present are just those champion descendants, save for Tulin, who is the son of Teba from Breath of the Wild. They are a few years older, so naturally their personalities have matured over time. They still serve the same purpose they have in Breath of the Wild, but this time with much more involvement, including the game's finale. Complementing these current-day sages are those in the past. These sages have concealed their faces behind these special Zonai masks, and that's the only thing that really makes them special. They are just the ancestors of the sages we see today. Each and every one of them repeat the exact same words. Each and every one of them maintain a stoic personality, and each and every one of them have only ever appeared in one major memory, and almost nothing else is known about them. They literally don't have any defining traits, besides their family tree and their abilities. But, like, who are they? They largely go unnamed, at least without some speculation involved, but that's a whole different rabbit hole. They just go, essentially, to give our present-day sages some special statuses as sages, just so these characters can be just more than characters who apparently helped Link save the champions. The biggest problem here is that there's a lack of any sort of real connection to these past sages, but it doesn't necessarily involve the lack of their screen time. The champions indeed did show up a lot more than the ancient sages, but much of their actual backstories and what drew the player to appreciating these characters a lot more was that their stories were well described throughout the game's dialogue, journals, and even by location. The world that the player explores isn't built around for these 4 sages, but rather it's built as a derivative of Breath of the Wild. There isn't really anything out there that's referencing these sages outside of a set of structures in the depths that don't even remotely resemble the sages. As a derivative world of Breath of the Wild, the similarities of the sages' helmets seen throughout the entirety of the time we meet each of these sages bear resemblance to the Sheikah counterparts that you could obtain throughout the game, as well as their respective divine beasts from Breath of the Wild. Yet, ironically, nothing in relation to Breath of the Wild's divine beast and Sheikah technology were explicitly mentioned, outside of a number of couple side quests. The importance of context must have been overlooked by the writers, as this game was designed with the idea that there may be new players who have not played Breath of the Wild. But what's the point of trying to set up all these implications if the world was not designed that way? This may raise the idea that perhaps the past stages shouldn't really be as important as most players hold them up for. The whole story would play out the exact same way even without the existence of these past stages, because these characters already have a larger purpose to uphold. They did not need this level of commitment to help Link when they were already going to do so regardless of the sages. There are many other characters I could go on to talk about in Tears of the Kingdom, but oh man, that's just too much to go down, and they're all going through the same issue of the lack of continuity and the lack of connection to the player. Besides, I believe there is an even worse issue than just the character's writing. I want to touch upon this issue that I have with Tears of the Kingdom that not many people have addressed to the fullest extent. If we were to compare the voice acting and cinematics of Tears of the Kingdom to its predecessor, not much has actually changed, and not much has actually improved. We still have Zelda's very fake British accents, we still have some very slow speeches as a result of localization, and we still have all these weird quirks that stand out due to Nintendo's new dive into fully voiced dialogue. This is where most people typically leave that discussion topic, because there really isn't that much to add. This is the standards that were set focused on just Breath of the Wild, and there really isn't that much of a higher standard out there. If only that were true. See, Nintendo is really no stranger when it comes to these conventions. They've done extensive voice work before in franchises such as Fire Emblem and Xenoblade Chronicles. As a matter of fact, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 includes separate voice animations for English and Japanese, so lip syncing is generally just not an issue there. Additionally, Nintendo has worked with voice dialogue in the middle of gameplay, such as the aforementioned franchises. Maybe you could argue that, because Zelda is a different team than the Xenoblade and Fire Emblem teams, they have different levels of experience. Except that's not really the case. I shall reintroduce you to the game that turns the dial to 11 for standards, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. I will never shut up about this game. The only spin-off that Nintendo has kept an eye on 24/7, and a game that features tremendous amounts of voice acting, amazing cinematics, and dramatic moments. I know the story isn't that good, but come on, presentation here is phenomenal. The standards that are set in this game, the presentation, and the overall story structure encompasses what I like to call the neo-traditional Zelda story. It combines the traditional conventions of detailed, character-focused storytelling with the modern innovations of cinematics and voice acting. So let me ask this. Why does a spin-off game like this, with less development time, less amount of time to complete, have much more voice acting and cinematics than Tears of the Kingdom? I'm not talking just the increased number of cutscenes, but character-to-character interactions, real, fully voiced conversations, not monologues, conversations, even to the point where most forgettable NPCs actually have genuine voice dialogue. As a consequence, we are treated to various cutscenes in Tears of the Kingdom where only one character is speaking, while everyone else is making grunting noises. Yeah, I'm totally done with that. No verbal responses to commands, no follow-up to a conversation, just some monologue in front of a number of non-verbal characters. This isn't much of an issue in Breath of the Wild, as most cutscenes were more isolated. But in Tears of the Kingdom, it's so much more obvious that this game had a much smaller voice cast. Tears of the Kingdom just makes no effort to hide it. But you know what? That isn't even the biggest problem that comes out of it. I'm sorry. My biggest gripe with voice acting is just that this game just lacks voice acting for many major characters. The fact that Age of Calamity has so many new actors just boggles my mind because a lot of them were not asked to return, despite the fact that 90% of those characters make appearances in Tears of the Kingdom. Eric Braw did not reprise his role as Master Koga, and he did an amazing job. Very memorable.
Today! Right now, in fact! The stupendous chief of the Yiga clan, Master Koga! Is gonna kill you all! To death!
JP Craner couldn't get the opportunity to play as an older-aged Robbie.
Which means we've got ourselves a brand new, never-before witness. Guardian Model!
Christina V, who debuted as both Hestu and Tulin in Age of Calamity, didn't play Hestu at all in Tears of the Kingdom. Okay, well maybe she's in the credits, but I've never heard her speak at all. Any real dialogue here.
Oh, me? I am the one who brings song and dance to Korak Forest! Hestu!
Here's another wasted opportunity. Andy Gibson, voice actress of Impa in both old and young ages. She also did not get the opportunity to voice Paya, despite Paya's uncanny resemblance to young Impa. It just bothers me hearing all these default grunting noises from all these characters in place of potentially good voice acting. So much of that dramatic effect in the game is ultimately lost due to the inconsistent style of storytelling. I would be okay if Breath of the Wild was the only game to demonstrate this sort of storytelling, but with the fact that Age of Calamity exists and has a generous amount of voice acting that extends across 90% of the game, really makes it fair for me to say that the standards were raised much higher and the Zelda team failed to meet them. Normally, I'd end my old rants about this whole dramatized storytelling here and there, but my problems with the game's presentation extends beyond just the flaws of voice acting. It comes with certain aspects of the writing itself. Don't get me wrong, there are many moments in the game that are written quite well, and it does set up for some real heart-wrenching moments in the game. The climactic finale of the game, for example, from start to finish, is something that blows my mind repeatedly. Unfortunately, I can't say the same about the Master Sword scene. I already talked about the Master Sword memory and how it pretty much spoiled the plot twist of the game, but what I want to discuss is the actual scene itself. Why do I want to talk about the Master Seed in particular? It's because these types of scenes are essentially the major turning point throughout the story, usually done as a halfway point of the game or signaling the beginning of the finale. Even though it's not necessarily linear in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, both of these games portray these as the turning point for Link, where he has grown to become just as powerful as he was destined to be. The story is angled towards Link now being deemed worthy to face the biggest threat that Hyrule has ever known. Traditionally, throughout the Zelda franchise, the Master Sword scenes have been quite consistent, with the usual tradition of Link approaching the pedestal, magical chimes or pianos, slowly building up the excitement, with string and percussion music joining the fray to bring in more suspense and accomplishment, as the music crescendos to a peaking point as Link manages to pull the sword out and hold it skyward. This is the defining moment in many Zelda games, and it feels pretty epic every time it plays. However, few games actually have diverted from this path, opting for something more unique. 3 examples are Skyward Sword, Age of Calamity, and of course, Tears of the Kingdom. Skyward Sword's Master Sword scene was undoubtedly beautiful. There's simply no debating that. Link holds the Master Sword skyward bound, but this time without a pedestal, and he receives a blessing from Zelda herself. However, despite some of these differences, the scene does remain quite similar to any regular Master Sword scene, just more connected towards the player. What I want to draw attention now is Age of Calamity once again. To this very day, Age of Calamity remains to be the only time the Master Sword was obtained in the midst of a battle. Other games like the first Hyrule Warriors game provided Link with a moment to himself, and the Wind Waker was kind of more of a test against many difficult enemies, but nothing really comes close to this tense vibes that Age of Calamity brings. Link and Zelda both come really close to death, and then suddenly the Master Sword comes in at the last second to save them both. Then immediately, the player is put into a full-blown boss battle. That was an awesome experience. It not only characterized the Master Sword as being much more of a sentient being again, but it also gave Link a big moment that really encompasses the power of being a hero, even though his intention really wasn't to be one. That is a level of mastery I wanted to see from Tears of the Kingdom. So, what exactly fits my criteria for a good Master Sword scene? Well, here's a list. A. a unique setting, so not the Master Sword pedestal, not the Temple of Time, not the Sacred Forest Grove, somewhere unique. B, fully demonstrates that it's a turning point of the story. Link needs to know that he's ready to face the final threat. He needs to be told that, and we need to actually see it for ourselves. C, the Master Sword is characterized beyond just a weapon. So, in other words, either referencing back to Fi, or at least calling it something other than just a weapon. And D, this is the most important one, it's done during, or it is immediately followed by a high-stakes event, such as a battle. This opportunity to top off the cutscene is no greater than Tears of the Kingdom. To finally get a scene worthy of topping off every previous iteration of the Master Sword scene. Something to truly blow me away and leave me remembering this scene as something truly iconic. Well, what came out of all that excitement? Let's take a look. So, I'm not going to go summarize the whole thing, but I'll cover the main points of the cutscene. We'll skip through the whole quest of finding the Master Sword because that varies between player to player. And we're also going to assume the player has enough stamina. Where we begin is where Link first lands on the Light Dragon to see the Master Sword embedded into its head. Link attempts to take the sword, but is caught in a dangerous struggle to hold onto the dragon and pull the sword out. Godly music is heard throughout this attempt, leading into Zelda's theme, right as he and the dragon are transported to this mysterious realm. Here, the dragon loses its hair for Link to take the blade, as the legendary theme, hand in hand with Zelda's theme, is heard throughout. Link then receives a message from Zelda that she has restored the Master Sword, now with her own powers to take on Ganondorf. Zelda speaks of the sword as if it were a being, a female being, who has fought Ganondorf before and is ready to take on Ganondorf once again. Zelda ends the message with prayers that the sword will reach Link in the future, implying that this dragon who we saw in the background all this time was actually Zelda herself. Link is then dropped off at the point where he first parted ways with the Master Sword from the very beginning of the game. He then watches the Light Dragon in silence as it departs into the skies. Here's the thing. I believe the music in this cutscene was absolutely phenomenal. I believe the characterization here was amazing. I genuinely enjoyed going through this. Almost immediately, it ticks off the first point of being somewhere else other than the Master Sword pedestal. It also makes a big effort to make the Master Sword its own character, which we already know as Fi from Skyward Sword. It's 100% the turning point, where Link finally reunites with his blade that he had from the very beginning. He now has this weapon to defeat the very evil that put him and the entire kingdom in conflict. But it doesn't actually have Link demonstrate the true power of the Master Sword right at that very moment. Zelda talks about how powerful this weapon is after thousands of years of slumber, and now it has her powers. She quite literally hypes up this weapon to be the catalyst to ending the conflict, but words can only describe so much. What we never actually get to see is that power, up until way after Link leaves the Light Dragon. I can understand that the intent was probably to give Link and Zelda a brief reunion to themselves, uninterrupted, to let those emotions sink in. But the way that Zelda's message ends almost feels like there should be something crazy happening right at the moment, rather than a moment of silence where Link simply just takes in the presence of the Master Sword. Just imagine how cool it would have been if there was some big enemy to interrupt him and the Light Dragon, giving Link a chance to put his weapon to the test and absolutely destroy this monster. Not only would that fully emphasize Zelda's words, but it also sets the bar at a much more reasonable level of expectation for just how powerful Link can be. I could talk more about these smaller issues ranging from the inconsistencies of the NPCs, the mysterious disappearance of the Sheik attack, or simply the fact that this game's story relies too heavily on implications rather than actual substance. However, they can largely be summed up towards that singular problem of how continuity is being handled here. It's understandable that the story is trying to avoid too much continuity as a way to allow new players to enter the game without feeling alienated or obligated to play predecessors. After all, Breath of the Wild is a huge game in its own right, and Age of Calamity may not be everyone's cup of tea. But at the same time, it is so far reserved that the idea of welcoming new players might actually backfire. Without proper amount of context, you wouldn't come to understand why this so-called kingdom that you're playing is, well, just a ruins of a kingdom, despite the title being called Tears of the Kingdom. You wouldn't really understand why in a high fantasy game you'd be seeing this technology that advances way beyond a steampunk level. You wouldn't understand why Zelda, the princess of the kingdom, acts like she's not a princess and more of a nerdy researcher. On the other side of the spectrum, returning players simply don't get that connection. There's too much of a gap between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. and it's very noticeable and left unexplained. And while some points here and there are very easy to interpret and connect the dots with, there's just simply too much ambiguity that such arguments against one another theory creates the problem that stacks on top of the already annoying issue of trying to address the Zelda timeline. This story is written in such a way that it wants to be independent, but at the same time, it tries to maintain that continuity and balance as if it was important. Yet, we're stuck in this gray area, where neither side actually takes full effect, leaving us with a rather bland story on both fronts. The lack of a good presentation towards the story ultimately left this game with a rather bittersweet result. We waited 6 years for the sequel to come out, and while I would gladly put this game over many other action adventures, I can't deny that this game definitely had a lot more wasted opportunities, looking at just how it was marketed to be. It failed to succeed the predecessor, and it even failed to succeed a spin-off's level of presentation. I truly hope that Nintendo decides to return to something a little more independent in their next iteration. They don't need all these fancy cinematics and voice acting to accompany the new game, but if they were to go with it, then they should really go all in. Their stories don't need to have continuity to be good, it doesn't need to be a sequel. They just need to remember to actually write the story. Period. Don't get me wrong, I will still play Tears of the Kingdom, but it's not something I think I could play again after 100%ing it. It's not because it's a huge game. It's because it's a huge game with fun gameplay, but barely enough substance to keep me thinking that this was a magical adventure. Achieving that balance between gameplay and story is exactly why some games ended up being incredibly replayable. They don't exhaust the player or push them into this mind-numbing grind. They don't seem too daunting for the player to sit through, with the game being so repetitive and same. They ultimately lie where most modern video games should be striving for. Something easy to return to, something worth every hour you spend, and ultimately, something that you could truly call an experience.